Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Council on Foundations COVID-19 Response webinar series. Today, we will be doing a policy briefing on how the $2 trillion COVID-19 economic stimulus bill impacts philanthropy. We hope you enjoy. Now I'm going to pass it over to your moderator this afternoon, David Cass.
Thank you so much. I serve as the Vice President for Government Affairs and Strategic Communications, as it says on the slide. And let me welcome you. First, I just want to convey my best wishes for everyone's health, and I hope you and your loved ones are doing okay during this really difficult time. So we are going to talk about the $2 trillion bill that passed on Friday, and we're going to talk about three things today. First is just what are the major provisions that will impact foundations and nonprofit organizations that provide services. We're also going to talk about what potential fourth bill there might be and what it looks like on the Hill for the legislative environment moving forward around COVID-19. And then third, we're going to talk about regional grant makers and what kind of work they're doing to be able to support the regionals in this crisis. So let me introduce the speakers. We have some wonderful speakers. The first is Ken Keyes, who's the Managing Director of the Federal Policy Group. Ken is one of the nation's leading tax experts, and he was the former head of the Joint Tax Committee on Capitol Hill and knows everyone in Washington. The second is David Thompson, who's the Vice President of Policy at the National Council of Foundations, who's just been a wonderful leader and partner to the council. And then third, Regina Bell, who's the Director of Government Relations and Public Policy at the Council of Michigan Foundations, also a wonderful leader and partner to the council. So as Manuela said, if you have any questions, please use the chat box on the right to be able to send them to us. We'll try to do as many of them as we can. Each speaker is going to speak for about 5 minutes, and then we'll open up for Q&A, and we'll try to get to as many questions as we can. So with that, let me turn it over to Ken.
All right, thanks, David. So I'm going to cover the key tax provisions that may be relevant to 501c3 organizations that were included in this bill that was signed into law last Friday. And then I'm also going to describe the SBA loan program that is also part of this legislation that is also available for 501c3 organizations. So let me just start at the top. In terms of the treatment of charitable deductions, the bill provides for 2020 a $300 above the line charitable deduction. For 2020, it also increases for individuals, the 50% of AGI limits is suspended. So that limit will not apply for 2020 for charitable contributions. For corporations, the 10% limit on taxable income is increased to 25% for 2020. So those are the key items with respect to charitable contributions. In terms of items impacting 501c3 entities, there are three major items. The first is a delay in payment of all the employer share of payroll taxes from the date of enactment of the bill, which was March 27, until the end of this year. So the employer share of payroll taxes does not have to be paid for 2020 for taxes due from March 27 to the end of this year. Those taxes will be payable in two 50% installments, one due at the end of December or on or before December 31, 2021, and the other honored before December 31, 2022. So that in effect is an interest-free loan from the federal government for a couple of years. A second item in the package is a employee retention credit, and it's a credit of up to $5,000, which is a refundable credit equal to 50% of wages for employees. So up to $5,000, a one-time employee $5,000 credit. The third item is this small business loan program, which is available for 501c3 entities. And let me just highlight kind of the key elements of it. It's a little complex, but I have to say they tried to slim this down and make it as easy to work with as possible. And in terms of process, the SBA has already put stuff up on their website. The way in which people will access these loans is through regular banks. And the SBA has stripped away, and the legislation strips away most all of the normal requirements that exist in the current SBA loan program. So no requirement of collateral, no guarantees. It is an attempt to make this as streamlined as possible. All right, so let me identify 4 elements of the loan program that are important to understand. The first is what's the maximum amount of a loan that you can get. The second is what's the actual amount of the loan that you can get. So the maximum may be larger than the actual amount you're entitled to for reasons that I'll explain. The third element of this is, of the actual amount of the loan that you get, what part is forgivable, as in you don't have to pay it back. And a final element of this is if I lay off employees during the period of my loan, will I lose some of the forgivable nature of the loan? And the answer to that is yes, and I'll explain in as simple an example as I can share with you. So let's go back to the top. What's the maximum amount of the loan? The maximum amount of the loan is the lesser of $10 million or 2.5 times your average monthly payroll for the past year. So if your average monthly payroll for the past year was $100,000, then the maximum amount of the loan is $250,000. That's the maximum amount of the loan. The actual amount of the loan that you can take is determined by calculating actual costs from February 15 to June 30 of basically all operating expenses. So that would include payroll costs, although compensation cannot be taken into account to the extent it exceeds $100,000 annually. Group health benefits, salaries, commissions, interest payments, rent, utilities. You calculate all of those payments for the period of February 15 to June 30. That's the maximum amount of your loan. Now, obviously, if that exceeds the $10 million or the 2.5 times your average monthly compensation, you would be limited by those maximum amounts. But then there's another important feature to this loan program, and that is the forgiveness component. And the forgiveness component allows you to look at all those expenses I just described and calculate them for an 8-week period. And that amount is forgivable. In other words, you don't have to pay it back. So the maximum amount of your loan may exceed the component for the 8-week period. It's the 8-week period that is forgivable. And again, it's actual amounts paid in an 8-week period for payroll, salaries, mortgage obligations, rent, utilities, etc. If during that 8-week period you reduce the number of employees that you have, part of the loan forgiveness is disallowed. And I'll give you a real simple example. Let's assume at the beginning of the 8-week period you had 4 employees. Sometime during the 8-week period, you furlough one of those employees. So 25% of your employees was furloughed. Your loan forgiveness will be reduced by 25%. That's the way in which the clawback or the disallowance of the loan forgiveness works. As long as you keep your people employed during that entire 8-week period, you're not subject to any disallowance of your loan forgiveness. The final thing I want to share with you is that you can't take all of these provisions together. So you can take the payroll tax deferral and the employee retention credit. So remember, the payroll tax deferral allows you to not pay the employer share of payroll taxes through the end of the year. You can take that benefit and the employee retention credit, which is the $5,000 credit. You cannot take the employee retention credit and the loan forgiveness. Okay, I don't know what's going on there, but and you cannot take both payroll tax deferral and the loan forgiveness. But David, that completes my explanation of the tax and loan provisions in the bill.
Great, thank you so much, Ken. David, go ahead, please.
Hello, everybody. Ken's talked about some of the things I was going to address. I'm David Thompson, National Council of Nonprofits. I was wanting to talk about three things: how we got here in terms of the advocacy campaign, what are the key things that matter to charitable nonprofits, your grantees, and then perhaps everybody's favorite, the above the line, the universal, the non-itemized deduction, how it is and where we hope to go with it next. Background, where we came from. We were advocating like crazy for this bill, the CARES Act, while they were still negotiating and working on the prior bill, the Families First Coronavirus Response Act. We were successful in that, in securing tax credits for nonprofits. Most people were saying, wait a minute, we don't pay taxes, tax credits don't work. There's been an advocacy campaign for years to point out to Congress that tax exempts are different. And if you're going to do a credit, you're going to do a benefit to encourage organizations to do things, it needs to be a payroll tax credit. Well, they liked it so much that they applied it to the rest of the world too. So that's the good news. But the CARES Act started off not really paying much attention to the needs of the tax exempt and particularly the charitable nonprofit community. The community came together, Council on Foundations and many others, on a letter saying nonprofits are people too, we need to be included. So there was a community letter that had lots of pretty logos on it, identifying that nonprofits and foundations are key employers, are key to the economy, key to our culture. So pay attention and include us. Now, that had 40 different national organizations signed on. The next letter, we saw the first draft of the CARES Act, still didn't do enough. So we had another letter that highlighted key points that needed fixing. It was signed by 200 national organizations, a huge outpouring. We haven't seen that much before, so that was the great news. We were focusing on, we need to expand the relief, the loan programs. We need to ensure that smaller nonprofits are included. We need to do better with the giving incentive. And it paid off. There were plenty of good things in the CARES Act for nonprofits, for your grantees, and for you too. Ken highlighted a few of them. Let me just run through. There's the loans. There's the Paycheck Protection Program. That's the small business loan that all charitable nonprofits and foundations, even below 500 and fewer employees, can participate. Much skinnier credit criteria. The criteria are: you have fewer than 500 people, you existed on February 15th, you had paid employees, you're in. Through the banks, we're watching the Small Business Administration website to see what are the documentation requirements, which banks are going to be playing ball. We understand that Friday is when the system goes live. There will be a mad rush to banks. We've been encouraging nonprofits, call your banks in advance, find out what they're going to need, let them know that you're interested. That's the small business paycheck protection. There's also the economic injury disaster loans. It's a pre-existing loan program. They've increased it. You can get $2 million emergency loan, or an express loan. You can get more. You can actually get $10,000 in 3 days under certain criteria. It's a good deal, and it's a big deal. And then there's these mid-size or mid-size business credit that nonprofits can participate in. That has that's mid-size, meaning 500 to 10,000, which is large for most of us. They can get 2% credit. That hasn't been worked out yet, but they're developing it. They're working on it. Ken mentioned the employee retention refundable payroll tax credit. Again, it's payroll tax credit, and it's refundable, so that if you pay your employees, keep them on, you will get a check. If you use up your payroll tax, your employer side payroll tax, you'll actually get money back from Treasury. So it's a refundable tax credit. There are also unemployment insurance provisions that help individuals. Nonprofits are not helped. We only get reimbursed 50% of our costs if we are self-funded, which many larger nonprofits are. That's a problem going forward. Now the universal deduction, the above the line, we're in. That's the good news. It's a $300 deduction for an individual, $300 for a couple. It only applies to this year, and it's only in effect for 1 year, for 2020. Advocacy is already keying up. We want more. We want better. One of those things is we want to apply it to 2019 taxes. We do this with every disaster. You're allowed to give money now and take it off on your prior year's taxes. We think that's important for both this universal or above the line deduction, as well as for itemizers. That's key. Lifting of the caps for itemizers is also a good deal. On the universal, on the above the line, we want to lift that cap. 300 is minuscule. It's a start, but it can't be the end of it, and we want to go longer. So those are the key things we're lobbying for. Those are the key things that we lobbied for and got in the bill. We're very happy about some of them. Devil's in the details, waiting on SBA, waiting on Treasury to work out the details. But so far, everyone's engaged, paying attention. We want to keep our employees on the payroll, and there are lots of programs to help. David, back to you.
Thanks so much. Well, I know there are a lot of questions. Regina, why don't you go next, and then we'll answer people's questions as many as we can.
Sure. So Regina Bell with the Council of Michigan Foundations, and just wanted to extend a hearty thank you to you, David and Stephanie, for inviting me to come and participate in this conversation. So the other thing I just wanted to acknowledge is that, you know, if you really think about it, we were all living together on the Hill as this was breaking, and really the impulse was to immediately abandon our agenda and point toward the immediacy of the crisis. And so we really had to hold this tension of understanding the problem, the public sector response, and also the work that our members needed from us or from regional PSOs. And so I just wanted to kind of acknowledge that many of us were at Foundations on the Hill during this time frame when things were kind of outbreaking. And as a result, we were really, I think, well positioned to be able to kind of respond as we think about the rich work that David outlined regarding how we were providing joint letters and being able to use the sources of the Council of Foundations as well as the National Council of Nonprofits to be able to do letter writing of our congressional members who had just heard from us from Foundations on the Hill. So what I want to be able to do today is just to talk a little bit about what regional grant makers, what our role is as philanthropy serving organizations. Also describe a little bit of our advocacy outreach during the legislative process, and then be able to articulate some of the concerns that we're hearing from some of our membership. So as I indicated, we were able to, much like the national infrastructure organizations, compose a joint letter between Michigan Council of Foundations, Michigan Nonprofit Association, and also our United Way. We also were strategically doing outreach to our members of the congressional delegation, to our congressional members. In addition to the letter writing, we invited our congressional members to actually join a webinar and have conversation with our membership so that they could actually hear directly from our members where the concerns were. And I'm really proud of the work that we've done, and we, along with all of the other kind of regional PSOs across the country, being able to kind of support some of the national work, because at the end of the day, we know that many of our congressional members rely on hearing from folks that are in their districts. So it was not a matter of either or, it really was a both and strategy. The other thing that we actually have done at the local level is leveraged what we have is an Office of Foundation Liaison to be able to connect with our governor and also our department heads around concerns that they actually were hearing and that they have as we think about the federal dollars that are coming to the states and the sense of urgency with which to get those dollars out the door. And so as a result of those conversations with the governor's office and also department heads, we were able to think about opportunities where philanthropy could serve as a real partner with government, also recognizing that there is a need to partner, but not to usurp government's kind of responsibility as we think about response. And so as a result, we also are looking at a joint letter that's going to be communicated with our state lawmakers around the work that could be done to keep nonprofits and the charitable sector whole. So for example, recognizing that there are a number of nonprofits that actually have contracts with government. So making sure that as they're thinking about shifts and changes, that we are ensuring that those organizations are being kept whole in terms of reimbursement for contracted services, et cetera. And then what I'll just also kind of lift up in terms of things that we're hearing from some of our membership is really around the immediacy with which we need to get these dollars on the ground, and specifically the 7A loans that were earlier referred to, and how our members are accessing them, and conversations that actually need to occur with lending institutions, and how are we best kind of delivering and recognizing that we as a charitable sector or foundations keeping ourselves whole, but also communicating these critical needs out to the nonprofit organizations that we work to serve. So there is kind of that immediacy and understanding coupled with the desire to really think about how we respond long term and utilize this as an opportunity to be able to shine a light on some of the failures that are occurring in the safety net infrastructure so that we can actually really move toward a sustainable change. So I think this is a moment of opportunity as well to be able to lift up some of those critical conversations as we continue to keep equity and the impact that this is having on low-income families at the forefront of our thinking in response efforts. I'm really proud of the work that the Council of Michigan Foundations has done under the leadership of Kyle Caldwell, and also recognizing that our communications team, we were fairly quick in standing up a COVID-19 resource page for which our members could access information. But I do think, again, it's a delicate balance of how we pivot some of these conversations to be able to focus on the long term around how we fill some of the holes that we know exist in our infrastructure, and utilizing this as an opportunity to begin that conversation. David, back to you.
All right, thanks, Regina, so much for the perspective from the regional. I want to turn it over now to Stephanie Powers, who is a longtime leader at the Council on Foundations, and she's going to throw out the questions that we've been getting from folks. So Stephanie, let me turn it over to you.
Yeah, thanks very much, David, and good afternoon, everyone. And I think it would be an understatement to say that we have quite a few questions. So I'm going to try to flip through some of them. I think what we can do too is try and do an FAQ, give us some time to sort through these questions and maybe then post a follow-up FAQ. So we're pretty sure that lots of people probably have need the same kind of answers. So let me just flip through some of these try to get through some quickly. If we don't get to yours and you would like to contact us again, please do so at our govt@cof.box, our government affairs box, and we'll be keeping an eye out. Okay, this is for Ken. Ken, you were breaking up a little bit when you were talking a bit about some of those three provisions around the payroll tax deferment, the employee retention credit, and the loan forgiveness. Could you kind of talk about how those kind of work together or don't work together? Can you clarify that and go through that again quickly?
Yeah, sure. So you can claim the payroll tax deferral and the employee retention credit. You can claim both of those. You cannot take the employee retention credit and the loan forgiveness. So if you're taking the employee retention credit, that's the $5,000 credit, you're not entitled to the loan forgiveness. You also cannot take the payroll tax deferral and the loan forgiveness. So remember, the payroll tax deferral says the employer doesn't have to pay the employer share of their payroll taxes from March 27 to the end of this year. They get to pay them at the end of 2021 and 2022. If you are taking advantage of that, then you're not entitled to the loan forgiveness. So it's going to require people to look at what the value of each of these items, to the extent you can't claim two of them together, and decide which one is you're better off with. So that's the way in which those three items work together.
Right. Okay. So Ken, are you able to talk about the changes that now enable private foundations to make grants to individuals in need without the IRS pre-approved that's normally required?
Unfortunately, I'm not.
Okay. Okay. And I will say to all of our audience, you know, we're all kind of waiting for the guidance to come out from places like Treasury and the IRS and various federal agencies who are scrambling now to put together their guidance on how a lot of these things are going to play out. So, you know, you'll just have to stay tuned as we learn more, as we start to see some of this guidance coming out.
Well, unless Suzanne, you want to take a crack at that.
Can you hear me? Yeah, Suzanne. Suzanne Friday is our legal counsel. So, Suzanne, are you able to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm with Ken. I don't know exactly where that is or what the details are. What we have been advising our private foundation members, and most of you probably know that if a private foundation were to have a program to make grants to individuals, like a scholarship or other assistance grants directly to individuals, they are required to get the IRS to pre-approve that program. And right now, I'm not aware of anything that has changed that. And we have been advising our private foundations that if they don't have a pre-approved grants to individuals program, it's probably best to look for a partner like a local community foundation or something like that, where you can make grants to, and then they can make the grants to the individuals. But you know, if Ken doesn't know it, then I wouldn't know it either.
Great. Okay. Thanks, Suzanne. We'll put a pin on that one and wait to see what we learn from the IRS. I think this might be something for David. Possibly, is the payroll cost capped at $100,000 per employee, or $100,000 total payroll cost of the organization?
That is per employee. The whole concept of all these loan programs is Congress wants you to hire people back. And they want, if you have laid off, they want you to go ahead and bring them back anyway. If you've cut wages, they want you to restore wages, but they don't want to subsidize above $100,000. So for both the loan, you're not disqualified if you have employees. For the Small Business Paycheck Protection Act, I think Regina referred to it as 7A. For the Paycheck Protection Program loan, you're not disqualified because you have higher salaried workers, and you're not disqualified from forgiveness because you have people earning more than $100,000. You just don't get the subsidy. You don't get the free money above $100,000.
There's a question here about if an employee quits and is not furloughed. I think that's related to maybe what that total payroll is or the forgiveness.
Mm-hmm. You could hire another person. It's full-time equivalents. So oddly, for the Paycheck Protection and a couple of the others, the head count is number of heads, full-time, part-time in particular, to whether you qualify. Then for doing the calculations, they do full-time equivalent. So if you have 4 people working 10 hours a week and they're all gone and you hire one person full-time, then you've met your full-time equivalent math. So it's salaries that do track individuals, but also full-time equivalents. If you hire someone to fill the role, that you're doing what Congress wants. So you still qualify.
And so kind of staying on the subject of employees and payroll, if an employee is paid $125,000, can they use the first $100,000 in the calculations? Do we have that kind of detail yet?
Yeah, I can answer that. The answer is yes. You can count the first 100,000. So let me just but I want to make sure people aren't thinking they're going to put $100,000 down. It's you take the average monthly pay, but you can't take into account annual pay of more than 100,000. So in determining your average monthly pay, you basically take 100,000 and divide it by 12. And because, for example, in the loan program, I mentioned that the maximum loan that you can take is 2.5 times your average monthly pay. So the way you would calculate that 2.5 is you would count monthly pay, but not in excess of 100,000 annualized amount, and multiply that by 2.5%. It would work the same way for purposes of determining the allowable expenses in that 8-week period that will qualify for loan forgiveness. You can take into account payroll in that 8-week period, but if it's an employee who's making more than 100,000, you can only take in the portion of their pay during that 8-week period that would be available if they were making 100,000. Okay.
Okay, thanks. Another question: can we elect to borrow just the amount that is potentially forgivable?
Answer clearly yes. You can decide how little that you decide to actually take a loan for. The limitation is you can't exceed the maximum amount, which I've said is 10 million or 2.5% of your average monthly payroll. But if you decide to take a lesser amount, that's perfectly fine. So you could limit the amount of your loan to what you project to be those 8 weeks of expenses that I've described, which is salary, mortgages, utilities, etc. You can absolutely do that.
And maybe staying on this topic of the loan, would fleet vehicle leases be a forgivable loan expense?
Okay, so let me think about this for a second. Okay, so I'm an employer, and I have leased cars for my employees to drive. That's the circumstance I think we're talking about.
Yes, I would say so.
Yeah. Okay, so the answer is okay. So what you're allowed are salaries, commissions, other interest payments on mortgage obligations, rent. That sounds to me like it's a rental expense. So I think the answer would be yes. Because I think I looked at this because of an earlier question I got, and I don't think the rent was not limited to like real estate. So I'm pretty sure the answer to that question is yes. You can count those for purposes of that 8 weeks of expenses that would give rise to a forgivable loan.
One of our attendees writes, I thought I read that if you plan on using the SBA loan with amounts forgiven, that you cannot also do the payroll tax holiday. Can you clarify that again, maybe?
Yes, that is exactly correct. You cannot take both the payroll tax deferral and the loan forgiveness. You cannot take both of those. So you either have to take the payroll tax deferral or you go with the loan forgiveness. I would point out the obvious, which is choosing the payroll tax deferral is going to be quite simple. You just don't pay any employer payroll taxes between now and the end of the year. The loan forgiveness is clearly going to be a little more complicated. As much as the SBA is going to try and make the loan process streamlined, the reality is that just the details of applying for the loan, et cetera, are going to involve some complexity. But if it turns out the loan forgiveness is sort of work, remember, it's forgiveness, whereas the payroll tax deferral is just deferring the payment of payroll taxes for a couple of years. The loan forgiveness may be considerably more valuable than the payroll tax deferral, and therefore make the hassle of applying for the loan well worth it.
Here's a question, I think, for community foundations. Can fiscal sponsorship funds at a community foundation access the small business loans? That might be getting really in the weeds. Suzanne, we might have to put that one on the list to be answered, huh?
Yeah, I mean, a fiscal sponsorship by a community foundation is still the community foundation. It's a project or a fund that the community foundation has taken responsibility for. So it would be the community foundation who applies for the loan if they want to take some of the proceeds and divide it up amongst their various funds. I'm not sure if that's appropriate. My understanding is these loans are to keep you in operations, not to carry out the work of your funds. But I don't know if Ken has anything to add on that.
Well, it's absolutely correct that the concept here is we're going to make you a loan to cover essentially your operating expenses to keep your business or entity, in the case of 501c3s, operating, keeping people employed and covering your operating expenses. That's clearly what the design is.
Great. So here's a question about, I think, advocacy, and maybe Regina, this is the one for you. This writer says, in my state, which is Rhode Island, there's an effort brewing to get the federal government to loosen restrictions on grant funds for current grants. Do you know if there are similar efforts elsewhere in the country, and would you have any advice for this type of advocacy?
Yeah, so excuse me, one of the things that I forgot to mention is that actually is part of the correspondence that we're going to be sending to our state leaders, and actually doing it as a joint letter that is going to be going to state leaders from Michigan Nonprofit Association. So our infrastructure organization in Michigan that serves nonprofit organizations, and then also United Ways. And I think that that is another kind of critical area that is not often kind of thought about. We've not necessarily faced a crisis of this magnitude. So we are going to be doing that correspondence, as well as making some direct outreach to lawmakers in the governor's office in reference to.
Stephanie, can I jump in on that? That is a huge issue. Thank you for raising it, because if nonprofits aren't getting paid, if government grants are canceled or delayed because of this crisis, they're going to turn to you. They're going to turn to your members to say, "Can you give us a bridge loan because the government's not doing right by us?" Federal Office of Management and Budget has put out two good memos urging federal agencies to cut nonprofits slack. That's great. The governor of Connecticut has declared we're going to keep paying on grants. We're not going to cheat the nonprofits. We're not going to put the burden on them. We believe this is going. I know Michigan is a leader in this area. I know that California and nonprofits and their regional associations are working hand in glove, working together on this issue, because that's a risk to foundations. It's certainly a risk to nonprofits, and most importantly, it's the risk to the people who are actually getting the services that are needed. It's a state advocacy and a federal advocacy issue where we can all engage and help.
And just something that's related, I'm wondering, Natalie, if you wouldn't mind maybe talking about the pledge work that's being done.
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, this is Natalie Ross, another vice president here at the council. It's great to see everyone on the line. So we've been hosting a pledge for foundations for the last week on our website. It's at cof.org/pledge. To date, we've had over 460 foundations make pledges around flexibility, changing restrictions, communicating and getting feedback from grantees in order to help nonprofits through this crisis. So if you'd like more information about what the commitments are, you can just go to our homepage and it's there. And we really welcome the commitment of philanthropy to really think about what nonprofits need at this time more than ever.
I know, David Thompson, you have to peel off because you have a big webinar that you're doing with your members at 3:30, but there's one more question here maybe I could throw to you before you depart. And thank you for joining us. So does this bill also cover 501c4 orgs that have a related 501c3? Payroll is run through the 501c4, but also covers the 501c3 employees. Yikes.
Complexification. The Paycheck Protection Program, the Small Business 7A loan, only applies to 501c3 organizations. There's the other EIDL, forget what it stands for, the disaster relief, which applies to all of the 501c categories. So it's a different loan for a different group. Because of the complexity of running payrolls through and things like that, the law does recognize that there are payroll services and acknowledges that and doesn't penalize for having payroll services. If the C4 is paying the C3, that strikes me as odd in the first place, but our read is that the C4 no, the C3 yes, and you've got to segregate the funding.
And I'm sure there probably will be further guidance on that from the IRS. So David, is there anything else you'd like to say before we sign you off?
Only that thank you Philanthropy for engaging, for the fund that Natalie was talking about, for supporting nonprofits in the community. Real people are hurting, and the loan programs are nice and good. A lot of nonprofits are having to make very tough choices of furlough, having to make choices of continuing operations or closing their doors and things like that. Moral support is truly helpful, calling grantees and saying, what do you need? How can we help you? Not just shoveling out buckets of money, but helping. There's an emotional toll here, and knowing that there's someone there to back you up is critically important. No one's been through this before, so we're all inventing the solutions as we go. As you invent them, share them with the Council on Foundations so that they can spread the word throughout the country. That's what we, the National Council of Nonprofits, are doing with all of our state associations and with other national nonprofits. When we see good ideas, we share them. Please use the Council on Foundations as the network for coming up with good ideas and accelerating them, because we're separate on the screen there, but we're united. We all have the same goal. So thank you for joining. It's a huge crowd joining. Thank you for that. Thank you for listening. Unfortunately, I gotta go. Bye.
Thank you. David, Cass, I'm going to turn this back to you for the moment. We have, of course, lots and lots of questions, but we kind of are at our time. Did you want to extend us a bit, or?
Yeah, I mean, why don't we go to 3, since it seems like we have more questions, and I'm wondering if one we want to go to is just around what, if there might be a 4th package and what that might look like, and wondering, Ken, if you wanted to address that.
Well, I can address it a little bit. I was on a conference call with Kevin Brady, the senior Republican on Ways and Means, earlier today, and he talked about the possibility of this, and the possibility of it was thrown out even before the president signed phase 3 last Friday. So that's been an active conversation. I can identify some things that have been thrown out. The president has said He'd like to see infrastructure. He talked about a number of $2 trillion. Historically, both Republicans and Democrats and the White House have said good things about infrastructure, but they've never been able to agree on how to pay for it. So that and I would frankly would be surprised that if we have a phase 4, it's on infrastructure, since I think if there's a phase 4, it's going to be because there's a continuing need to address the immediate economic suffering of people that have lost their jobs. And infrastructure programs don't really tend to create jobs for at least a couple of years from when they're enacted. So I kind of doubt that we're going to see that. There was some discussion in the last 24 hours about suspending the limitation on deductibility of state and local taxes. Senator Grassley, who's chairman of finance, put out a fairly strongly worded piece in the last 12 hours criticizing that, saying it would only benefit wealthy. I'm skeptical of the possibility that happens. In the call with Brady noted that the House members haven't even been told when they're supposed to come back. They're kind of indefinitely in recess. The Senate is theoretically supposed to come back April 20, but I think depending on where we are with the coronavirus, that could get pushed back. So we don't even know when Congress is going to be back in town. My own guess is if there is a fourth package, it again will be to extend the relief that's being provided to individuals. It might extend the time period in which these loans could be taken that give rise to forgivable debt beyond the June 30 deadline. That's the kind of thing that I would expect to see. Perhaps additional money poured into food stamps, additional money poured into unemployment. Those are the kind of things that I would expect to see if there is a fourth program or a fourth phase to this relief.
It's really helpful. Great, thank you. Stephanie, I guess we have time for a few more questions. What other ones have we gotten in?
Before we do move to another question, I wonder if maybe Ken could just continue a little bit longer. So what would be the advocacy that would, if a fourth package starts to materialize, what should be the call to action really to the folks who are on the phone then?
Well, that's a really tough one because Congress is basically shut down. So the notion of communicating in-person meetings is out of the question. Now, given the extent to which everybody is electronically communicating with others, that certainly is a possibility. I guess my advice to the sector would be to sort of stand pat right now and see where is this effort for a fourth phase real or not. For us to be asking for more things right now, I think might just look a little bit like overreach. So I think we have to monitor the situation very closely to see whether there is this prospect of a phase 4 and make a determination somewhere down the line here as to whether we engage from an advocacy perspective if it looks like that's is real.
And Ken, just to add to that, I mean, I think, one of the things that we have been pushing with a lot of our allies around the country is increasing the universal charitable deduction, which, as you noted, was $300. Senator Langford had an amendment to do it to $4,000 for individuals and $8,000 for couples. So, that's one of the things that we're going to be pushing and talking about as well.
Yep, I got it.
David, there's another question that probably would be our last one because it may be worth some discussion, but it's about DAFs, donor advised funds, and the universal charitable deduction. DAFs are not allowable for this temporary universal charitable deduction, and I must want to reiterate this is a temporary right now deduction. or the removal of the AGI limitation. But are other funds at community foundations then allowable, like designated scholarship, field of interest funds, etc.? I might throw that out. I don't know if Ken, that's something you could answer. Maybe Suzanne, Regina, have you been dealing with that in Michigan at all? Suzanne, do you have something you want to?
Yeah, I can speak to that. I've talked to quite a few of our community foundation members in the last few days about, you know, the unfortunate leaving out of the donor advised funds, as well as supporting organizations. And I think there was a question on that as well. Gifts, donor advised funds and supporting organizations cannot benefit from the new $300 above the line deduction. And the same goes for the increase in the deductibility limitation. You know, that's a carryover from longstanding kind of bias against donor advised funds. The IRA charitable rollover is still an example of that, and that's still in place. I think there was a question I saw scroll through about whether that had changed. That has not changed. I don't know. To Ken's point, it would probably seem rather overreach if we were trying to work on that right now in light of everything else. But yeah, those donor advised funds and supporting orgs are excluded from those provisions.
Yeah, and the only thing that I would add is that obviously we in Michigan have been hearing from a number of our community foundations who have expressed concern that DAFs are not included. And so as we think about, you know, opportunities for 4, 5, and 6, just wondering if there's a way to be able to kind of lift that back up in some of our advocacy efforts.
Yeah, and Stephanie, I'm sorry, I think I didn't even answer your question. For community foundations, there are still all of the other types of funds that community foundations hold. The community foundation can receive these gifts, these $300 gifts or larger gifts, because someone is now able to give more and take advantage of a higher deductibility. It's just the donor advised funds and the supporting orgs that are excluded.
Yeah, and maybe just very quickly, Ken, do these programs apply to private foundations as well as community foundations? We had several questions about that. Can private foundations access the SBA loans, et cetera?
It extends it to all 501c3 organizations.
Right.
So,
and no matter the amount in the endowment, doesn't matter how large, how small, correct?
there's no limitation based on the amount of assets that an entity holds, either for the for-profit or not-for-profit. The limitation is generally the number of employees, with the general rule being as long as you're less than 500 employees, you're eligible for the SBA loan program. You're eligible for the employee retention credit without any limitations, other than what I already reviewed, which is some of these you can't get both. But so generally, the threshold is 500 employees or less.
Yeah, so David, I think maybe we're at the end of our time, but I would like to offer to our attendees that we will be including a couple of or compiling a couple of slides that have resource sites on them that I think would be helpful, very specific. I'm trying to find ones that are very specific to these issues, you know, around these provisions for nonprofits. And there are a lot of groups in Washington that are doing these kinds of analyses. We're all kind of doing them based on, some of it's our own interpretations because we don't have the guidance from the federal government quite yet. So one thing I think that David Thompson was saying is that we all are in the philanthropy sector talking to each other and trying to share our information. So we'll do some sort of an FAQ. If you still have questions that you'd like to send to us, please feel free to do so at our govt@cof.org box. I'll be monitoring that box, and we'll probably end up doing some follow-up calls, I imagine, down the road once we see how the government is going to implement all of this. So David, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you everyone for being on this call. Thank you so much to our speakers. Here's a list of some of the resources we have. We have a resource hub where a lot of information. We also have a survey if you're interested in filling out to just share some information. For members, we have the Philanthropy Exchange, which is in real time. You can ask questions of colleagues around the country. And then obviously any questions you have in general that to educate@cof.org. So thank you everyone for attending. Hope this was useful to you. And obviously other questions, please let us know.